Hi folks, welcome to another episode of what is now officially known as experiential realism. To those of you who have followed me from the beginning, you have probably noticed the slow progress I've been making in terms of trying to make the channel look more professional, and I'm always open to suggestions. The primary objective of this outlet, of course, is to inform people and to invite discussion on the topics of science, reason, metaphysics, philosophy in general, and perhaps even social issues. Epistemology is important, the question of how much we can truly claim to know, and also the importance of being aware of how much we don't know. In a recent conversation with my son Michael, we touched upon the fact that there are probably many secrets, as it were, hidden in the depths of our oceans. This planet is about 70% covered by water, and even on the 30% of land, we still discover something new every day. Perhaps there is an Atlantis hiding in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, or some advanced civilization of cryptids who want us to believe that they are extraterrestrials. We don't know. It could explain some UFO cases. We don't really know where Plato got his idea for the fictional island of Atlas mentioned in Timaeus and Critias. This is why I like the movie The Abyss. Although the creatures were really aliens, their technology was phenomenal. Lately, I've been wondering about AI and have been listening to a few experts on this subject. Paolo Castrup and Federico Fagin have arguments against the idea that AI today is conscious. Fagin, in particular, formulates his case against such a notion predicated on the fact that all their computational states are replicable, whereas the human brain, which is quite different, involves non-replicable quantum states in what it does. Here we may find the distinction between the dreamer and the dreamed in representational form. In the end, as Donald Hoffman would have it, only the dreamer, or conscious observer, is truly real, whilst dreamed is only an illusion or mirage, which represents a state of mind in the observer. So the dreamed is only an illusion. It's not to be taken seriously. It's not necessarily a conscious observer like us. It's actually part of the fabric of mind, of our fabric, which extends beyond the body. The ostensibly external world is actually happening inside you. It's a product of conscious observers. It's also worth recalling how Nicholas Humphrey divorced consciousness from intelligence in his physicalist model. Although I don't subscribe to his emergentist theory of consciousness, his line of reasoning is useful here. Humphrey posits that only warm-blooded animals, such as mammals and birds, are phenomenally conscious due to generating enough energy to feed multiple feedback loops of representation in their brains. He starts with sentition and arrives at the ipsundrum, the brain's mathematical version of the gregundrum, or Penrose's impossible triangle. You can look this up. Cold-blooded creatures, on the other hand, such as lizards, snakes, fish, mollusks, octopi, etc., are pure automata, according to Humphrey. There is nothing it is like to be them. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this extreme, but Humphrey does make the point that although the octopus exhibits complex behaviour and intelligence, its acting biology and behaviour are purely based on mechanical reflexes, whereas a chicken, with its lesser brain and lack of intelligence, is phenomenally conscious. His argument here reminds us that intelligence is not required for the presence of consciousness, and consciousness is not required for the expression of intelligence. This also calls into question what we mean by intelligence, whether it always has to be intentional or not, and reminds us that behaviorism isn't a reliable way to determine whether or not consciousness is present in a particular system. Behaviour isn't a reliable indicator of the presence of consciousness. Behaviourism can only take you so far. It is quite fallacious, really. But one could still say that certain types of behaviour might provide some indication of phenomenal consciousness, and yet it is also possible for consciousness to be present in the absence of behaviour or any visible action. Humphrey notes that dogs exhibit playful behaviour indicative of exploring their world of qualia. They play with their sensations and explore the world. By contrast, lizards and snakes don't display such behaviour. Humphrey proffers that this is because dogs are conscious, whereas reptiles are just clockwork with nobody home. Unlike dogs, reptiles are cold-blooded. This makes me wonder about the implications of thermodynamics in a system and how that, along with entropy, maps onto Hoffman's Markovian dynamics from those decorated permutations. Giacomo Doriano postulates that when a quantum system is in a pure state, that system is aware of being in that state, meaning that it feels that state. It is interesting to note that one of the properties of quantum information is that it is always unique and it cannot be copied. So it has exactly the characteristic that we expect from consciousness, which is the privacy of personal experience. Pure quantum states are not comparable to anything else. The quality and depth of experience can only be felt firsthand, and no amount of symbols or representations can fully capture it. As Federico Fagin pointed out, compared to and in contrast with computers, whose structures contain transistors that switch between on and off states and have no information or knowledge about the rest of the system, our biological bodies contain trillions of cells, and incredibly, each of them contains the genome of the entire organism. So within each cell there is the potential knowledge of the whole organism. Therefore, every cell of our bodies is a part whole, just as we are a part whole of the one consciousness or universal mind. I am inclined to agree with some of the observations made by John Searle, and mostly with those made by Fagin, in that consciousness is incomputable and irreducible, or at least I've found their arguments more plausible. Intelligence is definitely not required for consciousness, and the conveyance of the former also doesn't require awareness, as it can be expressed in terms of actions or behaviour while the lights aren't on. As regards consciousness in its purity, I don't think it is created, but rather it comes through and identifies with a particular organism or energy configuration. It's when it becomes aware of being said system through self-awareness or metacognition. There is no emergentism in my view, other than the emergence of metaconsciousness. Another way to view this is, of course, to take into account Kastrup's Quicksilver Ocean analogy. It's all the same medium, the medium of mind or consciousness, as it were, doing its own thing. So there really isn't any coming through anything. It's doing its own thing. It's creating forms out of its formless nature, as it were. Through biology, we can certainly create more personal loci of consciousness, but I am dubious of AI, precisely because its states are replicable and computable, whereas consciousness is a purely quantum phenomenon, or beyond quantum mechanics, and unique to each of us. The mathematical representation of the experience, or a pure state, does not describe the experience, which remains private and knowable only from within by the system that is in that state. No classical machine can ever be conscious, given that classical information is reproducible. Program and data can be copied perfectly, while the quantum state is private. Consciousness is therefore not linked to the functioning of the body and can continue to exist even after the death of the body. The body behaves like a drone controlled top-down by consciousness. We must also remember not to mistake correlation for causation regarding mind-body relations. Sure, the character of one's mind and contents can change if we manipulate the organ that is our brain, but the awareness itself is not so easily apprehended and remains a continuous stream, even if experiences can be disjointed, making us think that we either don't recall something or that we were unconscious, when in fact no gaps are perceived. We should be careful not to be taken in by the appearances of the world and mistake them to be something outside of mind, lest we fall into the trap of materialism or even dualism. And I see so many people make this mistake, even in the groups, the philosophical groups that I frequent. The epistemology is clear. How much can we really claim to know beyond conscious experiences? All we can be sure of is the mind, because it is undeniably true, whereas its contents can be illusory and not trusted. The brain, like every other object in the universe, is a mere appearance and not the full story of what a person subjectively is. It is merely what that personal mind looks like from a second person perspective, as Bernardo Kastrup tells us. Just by looking at a person, we wouldn't know that they contain more power in their bodies than a bolt of lightning. 3.5 trillion volts of potential energy, because we have approximately 50 trillion cells in our bodies, 3,500 times stronger than a lightning bolt. This is a glaring example of why we shouldn't judge a book by its cover or make assumptions based on appearances. In a similar vein, the brain, or what someone looks like, their appearance, don't tell us anything about an individual's inner life. We never truly know someone. In order for that to happen, we'd have to be them. When we look at other people and believe we have them sussed out, we only think we know them. Wigner thought that consciousness, as the ultimate observer, collapsed outcomes on a quantum level, but the effect doesn't work on a classical level, and hence why fossils are part of a history that precedes us. We see the decoherence because we are simultaneously the one consciousness and also a private observer. The former as evidenced by quantum effects, and the latter restricted as a private mind that plays by the rules of the game which have already been devised. So we did and did not create the universe and its history. We are and are not responsible for the complex quantum wave that unfolded since the Big Bang. This may seem counterintuitive, but I urge you to take a look at John Wheeler's quantum eraser experiment, where it appears that we also determine the past with observation. Even the past is uncertain until observed. The reason being that the roots of reality are omnipotent and omnipresent, and our universe here being merely an incomplete projection of that non-local wholesome realm. The Pleroma I mentioned in precedent videos, I mentioned it with Robert Wagner. The realm which sources reality is omni-resourceful. So conscious agency there needs not compete for anything. Our illusory projection of a world, on the other hand, lacks information in order to be finitely defined. Because it's unwholesome, as it is only partially derived from Hoffman's decorated permutations within the amplituhedron, it cannot sustain itself. Hence entropy, hence the laws of thermodynamics, and life forms competing for scarce resources. Darwinism is merely a theory of self-preservation. Of course, we, with our anthropic avatars and the rest of the animal kingdom, have to fight to endure as long as possible against our precarious odds. Plato was kind of on the right track. This world is nothing but an imperfect shadow of a more perfect reality, and the very ground of existence is consciousness. It's consciousness because, as I said before, nothingness, by definition, cannot exist. The only logical step above that abstraction as the primary level of existence is the first person ontology, consciousness. Everything else can be derived from that primacy. As Rupert Sheldrake would put it, awareness can be cloaked in many colours and multiple dimensions. The mind is, quite literally, a kaleidoscopic God. Consciousness is formless, and yet has the potential to contain everything, an infinitude of forms. It is dimensionless and yet contains all dimensions. It is a radiant emptiness filled with a multitude of worlds. It is intrinsically devoid of concepts, and yet it can identify with things in conceptual reality. Hence the idea of the world. The contents of consciousness make up the mind. The universe is a mental matrix shared by multiple observers. These observers are the one, but the one appears fragmented into many due to the entropic nature of this reality. All exists within the one or the whole. This is monistic idealism. We all have that annoying and often repetitive voice in our heads. I say voice, but it's not really a voice that can be heard. And this voice can be quite negative to varying degrees and depending on the individual. The voice is a subjective expression of our survival instinct as it tries to protect or preserve the self-identity or ego, a fiction made of thoughts. And it can do this in a number of ways by urging us to worry about ourselves, be self-critical, be paranoid, seek well-being in general, and rehearse wishful and chronic thinking to keep the spirits up. But when confronted with certain realities about the world, this voice can be unhelpful and even noxious. It can lead to depression and even suicide. That's why mindfulness meditation is a potential panacea for mental afflictions. Although it doesn't apply to everyone, I'm pretty sure mindfulness meditation isn't the way to go for someone suffering with paranoid schizophrenia. Just as an exercise regimen applies to some but not others, because we all have different bodies, we're all different, and yet at the core we're all the same. When you meditate, in general, meditation is good for everyone, provided that you aren't as mentally afflicted as a schizophrenic, for example. But when you meditate, you take the first step in ceasing to chase by just pausing and paying attention to the contents of consciousness. You are not doing anything but observing what is, as you just allow it to be. That itch is annoying, but how interesting this feeling is face to face, as it were, in this moment. And you embrace whatever appears in your field of awareness. You are mindful in a heartful sense, as John Kabat-Zinn once put it. It is possible to reach a state where things no longer happen to you. They just happen in their own right. It is a state where the ego has fallen away and all that remains is pristine cognition. When this happens, the mind is strong enough to endure anything that consciously arises, even those experiences which were once deemed so horrifying they could break anybody. This mind, let's call it the Buddha mind for a minute, is aware of constant change and has become accustomed to it. A mind that does not behave based on wants and wishes, it has no reason for this because it has freed itself from the ego. A mind that is aware of the present moment and never gets lost. A mind whose annoying inner voice does not get a chance to interrupt and distract, not because the enlightened mind wouldn't allow it to emerge, but because the moment it's about to start, the knowing of pure awareness is already there to embrace it, to find that there is nothing to embrace because the voice itself is a fiction. It's not true. As the fictitious Patrick Jane in The Mentalist once said, the less you look at the world based on likes and dislikes, the more at peace you'll be with yourself. The Buddha mind can never be depressed. If you have such a mind, you no longer relate to what happens in a way that incurs suffering to a self. There are no tribulations, no bad dreams. You no longer think, I have an annoying itch. It's killing me. I'm dying to scratch it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. You just notice the qualia, and if thoughts must accompany observation from the enlightened perspective, they are more likely to be, there is a prominent itch. In that state, you no longer think without realizing it. You notice the thoughts the moment they arise, and these tend to go as quickly as they come. You have headspace, like a meditation app. You don't chase because you are free from desires. You are okay not chasing. You have peace of mind in the stillness, the only stillness where one isn't swayed by the restless monkey mind, a state where one is a mere witness. Here you are truly free, even from the narrative of self. John Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. You can disrupt the default mode network in your brain through mindfulness meditation. The exercise creates headspace, so to speak, to the point where you become aware of thoughts flaring up in your mind as opposed to realizing that you are thinking after the fact. It's a great hack against rumination. I believe enlightenment is absolutely real. I glimpsed it once and lost it. Or perhaps I am having trouble realizing or remembering my true nature in the sense of remaining there. In my experience, it requires cultivation of the mind. But then again, I only have my own mind to speak of. Other individuals might become as awake as the Buddha spontaneously and remain there, remain in the state. Although that's not my experience, I think that is potentially possible through cultivation especially. We have instances of people who have demonstrated that it is real. It is a real state on record with their actions. The self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc, who set himself on fire during political turmoil and social chaos in Vietnam, and did not scream as he was burning, was a clear demonstration that enlightenment is real. That monk was enlightened. The monk was at one with everything, the whole world, which included the form of a man burning, but there was no one to whom it was happening to. There was nobody there. The ego is a fiction. We're more than that. We're expanded. It's the realization that ego is only just another mental fiction. Basically, what took place when the monk self-immolated, it was just energy in motion, vibrations. This world is merely an incomplete derivative of a larger reality, hence why egos compete for scarce resources in an entropic world in order to preserve their biological bodies for as long as possible. What we see are partial representations of this derivative, but the source, the one consciousness, is the whole and infinite. It is pregnant with potential, and one does not need an egoic avatar in that realm in order to survive, because nothing is scarce and there is no illusion of separateness. It is all unity. The one consciousness is more real, and this reality that we currently live in is merely a projection deficient in information. Hence the collapse of the wave function and decoherence in quantum physics. The quantum realm, the roots of our classical world, with its superpositions, is what that complete realm of infinite potential looks like to us from our constricted anthropic perspective. Something that Sebastian Younger brought to my attention in dialogue with Dan Harris at the 10% Happier podcast is that if you give a group of people in a room LSD, you can be sure that they will all hallucinate, but they won't hallucinate the same thing. However, with NDEs, they all have a lot in common. the commonalities that I have talked about before, which often include visions of deceased loved ones. And yet, people who have close brushes with death undergo somewhat radically different physical traumas as triggers. Also, the consoling hallucination hypothesis, a la Freud, doesn't wash because many NDEers see deceased people they are not too happy to see, such as Junger's father in his NDE. There is also the case of his mystic mother who, on her deathbed, saw her estranged brother near the ceiling and wasn't too happy. There is also the terrifying visions a small percentage of NDEers have to account for. Junger's experience is particularly interesting, where he was brought up by a rationalist father and a mystic mother, left-brained versus right-brained. Junger has also pointed out that dead people also often appear to have a kind of universal knowledge in NDEs, which is redolent of the case of a family in a car crash where father and son survived, but the mother died, the man's wife. The husband had an NDE where he could see the wreckage of the car from a few feet above it, and he realised he was standing on a luminous platform with his wife in a column of light. He had a conversation with her where she told him exactly what had happened and that he needed to go back to look after their son, who was still alive in the back seat. The man woke up in the wreck to find that his wife had died. Even though she had only been dead for a short moment, in the husband's NDE it seemed like she had already transcended time and space and knew more than her husband, like she already had that universal knowledge by virtue of being deceased, and like her husband, a one-way ticket with no possibility of returning. There are also cases of deathbed visions where the dying see people they thought were alive who had actually been dead a short while unbeknownst to them. There is no materialist explanation for this other than a spooky coincidence. Materialism is just another religion that doesn't appeal to reason at all. I've had materialists dismissing Occam's razor as not really that important after I pointed out that materialism, unlike idealism, violates it. How can anyone in their right mind say that Occam's razor isn't important when it's a very useful tool to do science? Occam's razor is the law of parsimony. It's a law. It says that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. It prevents us from making too many assumptions. And sometimes we just have to be brave enough to call a spade instead of performing acrobatics in a bid to make interpretations of empirical evidence appear to fit what we deem to be the least crazy possibility. The moment we do this, we stop doing science and start flirting with dogma. If data appears to show that consciousness collapses reality, then this needs to be taken seriously. If delayed choice quantum eraser experiments show that observation appears to determine particles' histories and erases wave function interference, then we must even concede that the past doesn't exist until we, as consciousness, decide a particular version does with measurement. We must acknowledge the probabilistic framework of the quantum realm and its metaphysical implications. The fact that we can make a causally disconnected choice whether wave or particle phenomenon manifest in a quantum system demonstrates that no measurement independent causally connected substantial material reality exists at the microphysical level. Berkeley's immaterialism doesn't sound so crazy after all. Unobserved electrons don't exist anywhere in space and thus have no reality apart from measurement. There is no such thing as material objects at the microscopic level. Particles can only be said to exist in relation to measurement results and macroscopic appearances, but have no basis in unobserved, mind-independent reality. In other words, there is nothing outside of mind. The micro, it seems, does not require a physical substrate. Our mental life transcends quantum reality. when we realize that our conscious self is not in laboratory created macroscopic superpositions, but rather we observe them. We have substance, but the world of our experience does not. Just like Adi Shankara discovered centuries ago, consciousness is the ultimate reality. Our world is phenomenal, and consciousness is the noumenon. The world is carved out of perceptual possibilities across all 5 of our sensory modalities decohering, or destructively interfering if you prefer, to produce our world. There is something very interesting that my friend Nini Castle observed, and I could never deftly do it justice in the way that she put it. She is far more intelligent than me, so I'll just quote her statement. There's a lot of talk about, this is Nini Castle, there's a lot of talk about, do we have free will? Is there not free will? Are we deterministic? All that jazz. So one of the things I was actually thinking about, how space-time works, that we all know it takes light time to travel in space. So based on where we are in the 4th dimension, it's not like we receive the information omnipresently, instantly, non-locally. Say it how you want it. The information is omnipresent, it's omnipotent, the source. But for us, it takes time for the light to reach us. So if the sun does the solar flare, we get that information on Earth about 8 minutes later. On Mars, it's a little bit longer and it's further away. So here's the thing. I was born in 1985 and my parents were born in 1960. Everybody agrees that my parents are older than me. They agree that my parents were born first no matter where you are. Well, that's not necessarily true. On Earth, they'll agree because the Earth has been around more than the past 64 years. So that information from 1960 till now has had sufficient time to reach us. But let's say that we're in a galaxy that is 70 light years away. So that information now, they can argue that my parents were born after me, and my parents born in 1960 are surely born first, depending on where they are now. Depending on where they are, how fast they're traveling relative to me, and Einstein talks about that in time dilation and special relativity and general relativity. That's all spoken about. But the fascinating thing about this concept is, and as far as I'm going to give another analogy to break this down, that lag of time that we call space-time, that it takes time for light to travel through space, is exactly what gives us our free will, and subsequently it's also the inability for time to flow backwards. It's the forwarded arrow of time. And what I mean by that is that we have free choice. The analogy I use is going online to do some shopping. You go into your online place and you see all the stuff. It's all in superpositions. All those items are available for you. You haven't chosen anything yet, and you say, okay, I'm going to choose this item. I'm going to choose a new bike. So you click order. Now it takes time for that information to reach the site, and then further it takes time for the person to ship the bike and send it over to you. So while that's happening, before the item has actually been shipped, you still have the ability to say, actually, on second thought, I don't want this bike. I'm going to order a different bike. You still have time, so that is the first measurement, and that's where freedom of choice comes from. You have the options available, and even after you've made your initial choice, you still have time to make the repair before it's actually been solidified. Now the person actually ships out your bike and you go, oh shoot, that's the wrong bike. You can quote unquote still cancel your order, and you can quote unquote maybe get a refund, but at this point the bike has been shipped. You can't undo that. That's where the light has had sufficient time to reach you. The 8.5 minutes between the sun and Earth. The light has reached you. You can't undo that anymore. There's no undo button. That's it. So then you have the thing called repentance, forgiveness, whatever you want to call it, the ability to learn from the error. We learned from the error that the wrong bike was ordered and that we can't unorder the bike, but we can make a return or ask for a refund. There are other options. And then we learn from that, what can I do going forward and how can I repair? So there is nothing wrong with quote unquote ordering the wrong bike. but I'm using it to paint the analogy. The fact that light takes time to travel in space is what gives us our free will. It's what gives us our ability to learn, to repair, but it also gives us the one way forward motion of time, which a lot of people call entropy. Obviously, it's not, because entropy just refers to the information of a system. Unquote. So, as you can see, she talks about how our sense of free will factors in a perceived world of rules and possibilities, and mentions the implications of time dilation. We start to form a picture here about how observation is everything and has a fundamental say on what's true, without, of course, taking away from the fact that what is true can be viewed from multiple perspectives, like different parts of an elephant in a room being palpated by several blindfolded people. Each individual will have a different report on the same objectively true being. Of course, there are still questions about the nature of reality and mind in idealist metaphysics, but there are also many questions, and many more problems, mind you, when you look at the world through the physicalist lens, which is why I contend that idealism is far more compelling and more epistemologically consistent. Emergentism isn't science. Emergentism, in the context of studying consciousness, is only an assumption born out of a fallacy that materialists always commit. Cum hoc, ergo propter hoc. At the same time as this, therefore because of it. You could have two TV sets in the same house playing the same channel. What's on their screens correlate, but neither telly causes what the other one is showing. The original events are broadcast somewhere else. As I have said ad nauseum, correlation isn't necessarily causation. In written debates with Bernardo Kastrup, the biologist Jerry Coyne, who would like to be another horseman of new atheism along with Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens and Harris, didn't have a clue about idealism, and yet tried to defend physicalism against idealism by saying that every living being has qualia, or experience, which I would agree, providing the the example of water fleas, which are microscopic crustaceans, also known as Daphnia. The thing about water fleas, the example that Coyne provided, the thing about them is that they are devoid of a nervous system. They have only about a dozen neurons. So Coyne had completely failed to realize that Daphnia cannot possibly be conscious under physicalism. He contradicted his own statement. It can't possibly be conscious under physicalism because experiences are supposed to somehow arise from the complexity of a nervous system, which those water fleas don't have. So if these planktonic creatures have experience, which they appear to have, they behave as though they're aware of their environment, then consciousness cannot be the emergent product of complexity. The very example that Coyne provided appears to refute physicalism and ostensibly matches Kastrup's analytic idealism. Daphnia are not complex, and yet they exhibit awareness of their environment. Under idealism, of course, Daphnia are conscious as dissociated alters of the mind at large. Consciousness is therefore there from the outset. Jerry Coyne is not someone that can be trusted with metaphysical proclamations. He knows about evolution and biodiversity, but he doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to the philosophy of mind. Coyne is a provocateur. He once influenced the Scientific Advisory Board of TED to take down Rupert Sheldrake's presentation on TED Talks, branding it unscientific, even though there was nothing unscientific about what Sheldrake said. Sheldrake merely criticised the scientific community, meaning faulty human conduct in the scientific arena. He did not attack the scientific method itself. Sheldrake also pointed out that there is revisionary evidence indicating that the cosmological constants might not be so constant after all, an important observation which has been largely overlooked in the empirical sphere. The speed of light, for example, has dropped throughout decades when we compare the new physics textbooks with the old ones. It's embarrassing for metrology and for the scientific enterprise itself. The same goes for gravity. The measurements for gravity also have fluctuated throughout decades, and yet we seem to have this need to preserve the concept of a constant. So we round off all those results we had, which differ, and if we're not blaming the tests for being erroneous, we are coming up with averages in order to preserve the very concept of a constant. But there is no such thing as a constant, not really, if the results that we are getting from these experiments, from these measurements, all differ, all fluctuate. So anyway, Jerry Coyne isn't the kind of individual that should have any influence on TED's curation, and TED's board of directors should have remained steadfast after he kicked up a fuss about Sheldrake. The board of directors were practically pussies. They pussied out. Plain and simple, really. Rupert Sheldrake should be celebrated, really. Rupert Sheldrake encourages us to abandon old dogmas about how the brain and mind works. He points out that people who have been thinking about the mind-body problem in the scientific sphere have neglected the fact that we live in a world of fields of influence, and we have technologies that take advantage of this very fact. We have known for a couple of centuries now that electromagnetic fields extend well beyond the magnet, and the same is the case with the brain, where electromagnetic fields extend beyond the skull, which should prompt us to take seriously the notion of consciousness existing beyond the brain and physical body. Sheldrake has talked about how our experience of vision is more congruous with extramission theory rather than intramission, and explains coposthesia, the feeling that one is being stared at, which is very common. Looking for consciousness inside the brain is like looking for musicians inside a radio. No materialist theory of consciousness is plausible. As Nikola Tesla once said, "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, we will make more progress in one decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence." We need to start being brave enough in admitting that consciousness is the only reality we can be 100% sure of. The new mysterianism of Noam Chomsky is a defeatist cop-out. Chomsky may make a point in making a distinction between what seems solvable in principle and mysteries which do not seem solvable even in principle through scientific methods. He correctly points out that the cognitive capabilities of all organisms are limited by biology, such as a mouse unable to navigate a prime number maze, and posits that certain problems may be beyond the human ken. But there is something amiss in his mysterianist philosophy. He seems to make a generalization whilst disregarding context. In the realm of mathematics, even though we don't have everything sussed out, we can still intuit infinities, and we are aware that there is much more to learn. We know there is no such thing as the highest number, and we are aware of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. We are aware of how much more we don't know. When it comes to consciousness, however, if we look at what's right on the surface, we come to realize that it is akin to a field of awareness that includes all possibilities. We can realize it is at bottom irreducible and incomputable. It's the ground of existence. There is nothing to work out here because we are dealing with an ontological primitive. To counter mysterianism, we need only realize that a mystery is a puzzle. A puzzle is only puzzling until it's sussed out. I also vehemently disagree with Alexander Danvers' take on Mark Solmes's book, The Hidden Spring. This is an excerpt of his Psychology Today article entitled "Why Do We Have Consciousness?", which I found to be poorly written and thought out, besides being another one of those what ifs and this is how you could interpret the data scenarios. It reads, "We need findings according to Psalms because they help us decide which actions to take next. A positive feeling is the body's shorthand way of communicating a best guess that an action will be beneficial, while a negative feeling is shorthand for don't do that." Now, in this excerpt, who is the we? Who is the we in this statement? Who is the body communicating with that needs to be aware of things? Who is aware ab initio? The article doesn't solve the problem of consciousness under physicalism at all. And an effect is not consciousness, as the article seems to claim. Effect is information that arises in consciousness about the state of the body and how one feels about the world in relation to the body. In the following excerpt, who is comparing the feelings from predictions about available options? Doesn't the act of comparing things presuppose an already existent awareness? Doesn't the examination of a quote-unquote summary feeling require consciousness to be there in the first place? Phenomenal consciousness remains unexplained in the article. Perhaps the author and the scientists are mistaking metacognition or some cognitive process for consciousness, in which case the disagreement would be mostly semantic. Nevertheless, they seem to be jumping the gun. Who is doing the understanding? This is how the excerpt goes, and I quote, "If we're choosing between multiple options, we could just compare the feelings they elicit to get a sense of what our body and unconscious mind have predicted will result from each option. And just as the chunk of an area code can be further examined in terms of its 3 digits, we can also imagine further examining a summary feeling to understand its parts." Unquote. And what the article goes on to say is just as confusing, because consciousness is not the summary judgment at all. The summary judgment is also something that appears in consciousness, the fundamental witness. It goes on to say, and I quote, "Consciousness is fundamentally effective. The core of consciousness is the body and mind summary judgment, and what will and won't be helpful. It's also the one thing we can't even imagine being part of a philosophical zombie feeling." Unquote. I mean, it's just it's a page, like a page taken out of Dennett's book. It's just ludicrous. Moreover, under materialism, aren't somnambulists who practically perform complex tasks whilst asleep more or less like philosophical zombies? Sleepwalkers exhibit mostly delta waves and are, therefore, in deep sleep. As a philosophical idealist, I also question the notion of unconsciousness, because often we conclude that nothing happens when we simply don't remember. I would also consider deep sleep as a form of consciousness, but this argument would be going off on a tangent here to do with focus, or conscious focus. The point is that in somnambulist deep sleep, we don't get a summary judgment as the body performs complex tasks, at least not one that sleepwalkers can remember when jarred into wakefulness, which ostensibly subverts the notion that, under materialism, philosophical zombies aren't possible. According to Daniel Dennett, the king of materialism, we're all philosophical zombies anyway, because nobody is conscious. Not really. It's an illusion, he said. This is another example that sometimes great scientists don't make the best philosophers. These people have been peddling materialist dogma for quite some time now. It's the same people who have been dismissive of NDE studies without even looking at the evidence amassed by the scientific experts and professionals who looked into it with an open mind. As far as I'm aware, everyone who has investigated the phenomenon has become more open to the possibility of an afterlife. In fact, they end up taking it quite seriously because the evidence sometimes contains elements which go beyond the subjective, as content of NDE reports can contain information that is objectively verifiable. Materialists try to say that rapid eye movement or REM bursts REM bursts of brain activity could be involved in generating NDEs. But the problem with this theory is that people report having them in general anesthesia, which is known to suppress electrical activity in the brain related to REM. In fact, many report NDEs after their hearts have stopped and EEGs flatline. We also have no materialist explanation for how patients can accurately describe real events from an out-of-body perspective, events they couldn't possibly know about through conventional means. Could the electrical activity that represents one's mind exit the body? After all, electricity is invisible, and this could explain why doctors do not see their NDE patients, or even their recently deceased patients, exiting their bodies. Disembodied people, it seems, are invisible too. Surprise. We can see lightning because photons are squeezed out of electrons, and these are ripped out of atoms during ionization in the atmosphere. But generally speaking, electricity is generally invisible to the human eye. The neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor almost died of a stroke and underwent major brain surgery to remove a golf ball sized clot in her left hemisphere. This is her poetic description of feeling herself outside her body during her stroke. I felt like a genie liberated from its bottle. The energy of my spirit seemed to flow like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria. Finer than the finest of pleasures we can experience as physical beings, this absence of physical boundary was one of glorious bliss. Her mind, she ceased to be human there. Her mind clearly changed and her consciousness expanded. She clearly experienced something she had never experienced before. She became more than just herself. Her constricted self, I would argue. The mind is still somewhat mysterious, even under idealism, but we can explore our own minds through different types of meditation and lucid dreaming. The latter can provide striking insights, such as the apparent communication with an awareness or intelligence behind the dream, the topic of a recent discussion I had with Robert Wagner, or even ostensible extrasensory perception. I tend to have about 5 lucid dreams a month, give or take. And some mornings I can perform lucid dream chaining, which I manage to, where I manage to lucidly re-enter the dream world after a perceived brief awakening, and do this as many times as it takes until the REM phase of sleep runs out. I seldom do reality checks and no longer get so bogged down with methods of induction. I guess it comes easy to me even when I don't do reality checks. But I would still urge people who would like to have their first lucid dream to perform reality checks on a daily basis, and several times. A dream journal is also important because it helps you to familiarise yourself with recurring signs and themes in ordinary, regular dreaming. I had a lucid dream on the 3rd of August, a day after my wedding anniversary, and I still have many questions about the nature of the dream world. After becoming lucid in a dream plot that I realised couldn't possibly be happening, I flew up and went through a white ceiling to find myself beholding a blossoming spring field from a rooftop. I could see well-groomed trees and exquisite giant flowers adorning the green landscape under a clear blue sky. The scenery was vibrant with colour, hyper-real, and I couldn't resist flying over it. I love flying in lucid dreams. For me, there is a strong sense of freedom that comes with it. As I glided over the impressive vegetation, I noticed a purple flowery protrusion resembling lavender jutting from the grassland. Curious to know about its scent, I plucked it from the ground to smell it. Initially, it was odourless, so I gave it a good sniff, as I insisted on experiencing olfaction, and suddenly I could smell mint. Subsequently, I noticed that the sky was that white ceiling with lights dangling from it, prompting me to go through it again to investigate. So I ended up waking up. I woke up wondering about the mint smell. Where did it come from? It puzzles me because I would never think of lavandulas smelling like mint. Eerily, when I googled the lavender plant, I found an image of mint leaves next to it. It makes me wonder about where the sensory information is coming from in dreams. If that mint smell was not part of some random dream schema in my subconscious, I wonder if it was accessed by my personal unconscious from the collective unconscious postulated by Carl Jung. Was the image of mint leaves next to the image of a lavender plant on the internet a random coincidence, or does lucid dreaming enable some kind of perceptual precognition? All lines of inquiry are open to me at this point, however crazy they may sound to some. I can also tell you about a lucid dreaming example of what me and Robert Wagner were talking about, the awareness behind the dream. But this lucid dream happened some time ago now. This lucid dream involves a shapeshifter changing from a human to a snarly squirrel, or something like it, and then back to a human with grotesque big black round eyes. When he was initially a man, I asked what his name was, and he said Uzai. And immediately, for some reason, I thought his name was spelt Uzai. Then he turned into a snarly animal, like a squirrel, and I was afraid of it. But then I reminded myself that I was dreaming and decided to face my fear by sticking out my hand towards the overgrown squirrel's mouth. The frowning animal, which at times resembled a brown hare, it kind of slightly changed, immediately bit me, and although I felt no pain, I experienced pressure on my hand. Subsequently, the squirrel exclaimed with a human voice, with an aha, as though I had unlocked or uncovered something in a game. The character shapeshifts back to a man after biting me, shapeshifts back to a man with black holes for eyes, and pointing at the sky, he says, "There is a place prepared for you far, far away." It wasn't until I woke up that this finally began to make sense. The name Uzai could be the combination of the verb use and the pronoun I, as in use me. Upon awakening, I also remembered that I was supposed to go to the moon as part of a plan of action for lucid dreaming, but in the dream world, I couldn't recall it. Hence why I improvised by deciding to hop from treetop to treetop along a street like I was in a video game upon becoming lucid, before finally spotting a tall man walking on the pavement wearing a long brown coat. In hindsight, it seems that Uzai was trying to remind me of my plan to visit the moon, however cryptically. NDEs, on the other hand, appear to be a different kettle of fish. After delving into research and studies on this phenomenon, I found that certain elements are typical of it, according to the physician Jeffrey Long, who founded the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and others like Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the co-founders of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, or IANS. NDEs typically report an out-of-body experience, heightened senses, intense and generally positive emotions or feelings, passing into or through a tunnel, encountering a mystical or brilliant light, encountering deceased relatives, friends who passed away, or mystical beings, a sense of alteration in time or space, a life review, encountering otherworldly or heavenly realms, encountering or learning special knowledge, encountering a boundary or barrier, and a voluntary or involuntary return to the body. We are also told that NDEs are not rare. They are not rare. They are more common than we think, and many go unreported for many years as people fear ridicule or are afraid of being sectioned. Based on the evidence Jeffrey Long has come across as a physician practicing the medical specialty of radiation oncology and conducting investigations of the NDE, he is utterly convinced that consciousness survives bodily death. Many of the NDE studies that provide evidence for the reality of an afterlife were published in the world's leading medical and scientific journals. NDEs often occur in association with a cardiac arrest, and after the heart stops beating, blood immediately ceases flowing to the brain. About 10 to 20 seconds later, the electroencephalogram, which measures electrical activity in the brain, is flat. At this point, there is no measurable activity in the neocortex, so almost immediately after cardiac arrest, it should not be possible to have a lucid, organized, and conscious experience. And yet, NDEs occur while brain function is shut down. As an example, there's the case of a woman called Joan, who had a spinal anaesthetic for surgery on her ankle. There were complications and she coded, which means her heart stopped. This is what Joan reported, which was included in Long's research paper. Quote, "I went from being in my body to being in a place of absolute love. I can only describe it like being in a swimming pool, but even my body was filled with this loving. I was one with this place, but also apart from it. I was still me, but I was far more than me. I was one with everything, and it was all good. I did hear beautiful music, but it wasn't like our music. The music itself was part of me, but I don't think I was singing. It was more like it was just part of me, and I was part of it, but it was much more than just me. I felt weightless and free, absolutely free. I was enfolded in this loving and was part of it too. There was not one single part of me or part of anything else that was not love. Individuals did not exist in the same way as we do here. I was still me, but I was also part of the loving. I knew things without hearing a single spoken word. I was love. I knew that all religions had it wrong. There is no way rules and judgment could flow from this place. Earthly religions made it complicated when it was very easy. There is only love, and all of us are part of it. There is no way that we cannot be loved. We are love. Time did not exist. I have always loved my family on earth, but I did not miss them. I did not think of them. I was more joyful than I ever have been. I felt utterly connected to everything and everyone. We are interconnected as one. There is no such thing as death. This experience has changed me." Unquote. So that was Joan's experience and how she described it. As you can probably tell by now, this NDE, like many others, seems to agree with the ancient Hindu philosophy of non-dualism, Advaita Vedanta, the Vedas, the Upanishads, monistic idealism. When it comes to Brahman, divine consciousness, the whole and the source, God if you will, there is no nepotism going on. Everything possible is permitted, and all polarities are different sides of the same coin. It also agrees with Hermetic idealism. It agrees with the Kabbalion. There is, according to a preponderance of reported NDEs, unconditional love for all, no favourites, no Yahweh to smite you, as there is a wholeness experiencing a multitude of things that make up the mind at large. We are all a single mind in the end. We make up the one. And ultimately, it is individuals who judge themselves. Throughout history, there are many examples of things rejected as unreal and deemed unworthy of scientific study, which were later found to be true. Prior to the 19th century, the majority of scientists thought reports of meteorites were tall tales, not worth investigating, even though there are very ancient accounts of rocks falling from the sky. Germ theory was ridiculed until well into the aftermath of the Age of Reason, even though tiny invisible agents had already been hypothesized in ancient Greece as the cause of plagues. For the longest time, NDEs have also been dismissed as either hallucinations or fabrications because they simply don't fit the doctrine of materialism. The NDE phenomenon, like consciousness in the annals of science, was unfairly treated with dismissiveness instead of a healthy dose of skepticism. But things are changing. American and European mnemonic studies have found that memories of NDEs are more like memories of real events, but unlike memories of dreams, hallucinations, or imagined events. Moreover, NDEs are often remembered as more real than real events, just as real events are usually remembered as more real than imagined events. In Italy, a research team measured brainwaves while experiencers were remembering their NDEs and found that their brainwaves were like those associated with recalling real events rather than recalling imagined events. There is a metaphor that Alan Watts used when he tried to dismiss the concept of causality and reinforces the primacy of consciousness and the emergence of time as a phenomenon. Watts said that we are in the position of a yogi sitting in front of a fence with an extremely narrow vertical slit through which we can see what happens on the other side, where a cat walks by. First we see the cat's head, and then we see its tail, and every time the cat walks past we see the head first and then the tail. The yogi is bound to prematurely and erroneously conclude that the head causes the tail, a conclusion based on a partial view of something that happens all at once. In reality, both the head and tail exist simultaneously. The cat as a whole doesn't exist as a sequence of events, but rather it exists all at once. Time is only a traversal of the database that includes all things. In other words, time only represents a partial view and only one way in which reality can be perceived. So the yogi perceives a pattern of behavior much like a scientist and presupposes causality, thus committing the post hoc fallacy. In the analogy, the cat is precisely what takes place in a transcendent reality outside of time. I'll leave you here with a quote by Rumi, followed by a proverb. O soul, leave behind this world of separation and come with us to the world of union. How long will you play in this dusty world like a child filling his skirt with worthless stones? And the proverb, just when the caterpillar thought the world was ending, he turned into a butterfly. Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Experiential Realism. Thank you very much.